Welcome to Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier. We're now 3 months, 1/4 of a year away from an election. The results will mean a lot for how the country manages the coronavirus pandemic and its shaky economy. But it will also determine a lot of what our future climate looks like. Today we're going to discuss the 2020 election and climate change with a couple of reporters who've been following the story. In a bit, we'll talk with someone who's following Joe Biden's evolving climate policies and about why he's gotten more aggressive on the issue recently. But first, I'm joined by Justin Worland, a reporter who covers the environment for Time magazine. Worland recently wrote a cover story for the magazine titled 2020 is Our Last Best Chance to Save the Planet. Justin, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Justin, you write, in the future, we may look back at 2020 as the year we decided to keep driving off the climate cliff or to take the last exit. I was just wondering if you could explain what you mean by that. Why is this election so important for climate change?
Yeah, so there's really several reasons, but I guess I would start with the science and just look at the numbers here. The planet has warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And, the Paris Agreement says we should try to keep temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, we might experience some dramatic tipping points that could really alter life on this planet as we know it. And so we really don't have much time. And then you add the fact that we have this pandemic, which has obviously created so many health problems, economic problems, et cetera, but also led to the spending of trillions of dollars to recover, to deal with the pandemic. And that money can be spent in a way that's green, in a way that, rethinks the way we live, or it can be spent to sort of reinforce our old way of living. And we're not going to get an opportunity like this again, on the one hand. And on the other hand, if we don't take the opportunity, we're going to lock in a high carbon world. And so I guess I would finally say, to your point about the election, around the world, this is a topic of discussion. In the U.S., under President Trump, it's highly unlikely that we're going to really do anything to take on this issue, and under a different president, that might not be the case.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could just unpack that a little bit. So what is it about the Paris Agreement, the sort of timeline laid out by the Paris Agreement, that makes this year or the next few years so important?
Well, before the pandemic, and apart from the election, this was supposed to be a critical year for climate change. The Paris Agreement has what they call ratcheting up, what's called ratcheting up. So countries were supposed to come together in 2020 and outline new plans to reduce emissions, to try to bend the curve. That was supposed to happen in November, and that summit has now been postponed by a year as a result of the pandemic. But the Paris Agreement did make 2020 a key year, and there were a number of other key conferences that were meant to build momentum to this big international climate conference.
So the world is positioning itself to ratchet up its climate commitments. I was wondering if you could also talk about what effect the coronavirus could have on our timeline to act on climate change. Why would the coronavirus and the ensuing sort of rebuilding package, why would it matter so much for climate change?
Well, this year, countries and financial institutions have spent some $11 trillion. They're going to spend trillions more in the coming months. And that's funding, that's money that otherwise would have been spent over the course of the next decade. And so, just think about it. These discussions are happening right now around the world, but you go to a place like China, where they're looking to continue their expanding their electricity generation. They're going to decide right now whether to build more coal-fired power plants or whether to build more renewable generating capacity. And that's something, once that money is spent, it's not going to be spent again. And China's a prime example because they had funding that was supposed to take place over a 5-year period, and they're pushing to try to pull that funding forward. So these decisions are happening really quickly, in response to the pandemic and I guess more precisely to the economic fallout from the pandemic.
So this is basically our allowance for the next 10 years. We're going to spend it in the next two.
That's a great way to put it. We have a pot of money that we were going to spend over 10 years, and now we're going to spend it over two.
So one really fascinating part of your story was this point about how the current climate crisis we're in was made in part because of decisions made during the past, obviously. But you're talking specifically about the aftermath of World War II, when the U.S. economy sort of grew out of the wartime economy. We see the growth of the automobile and plastics industries and the Marshall Plan in Europe. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why that era, cast such a long shadow in terms of climate.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned several of the examples, but I think it's really important to understand, everything that we do in this country, for the most part, runs on fossil fuels, and largely, coal is still a part of our energy mix, but in large part on oil. That was a conscious decision that was made during, the economic downturn and World War II, and then in the post-war period, to do everything from, I mentioned in the story, the biggest line item in the Marshall Plan was to support oil. It was a conscious decision when the U.S. built a bunch of capacity to build plastics for wartime purposes, to then use that to build consumer products. You look at the measure of GDP, which came out of GNP, which was a measure developed during the war as a measure of economic output, which then prioritizes consumption, which is based again on having an unlimited supply of oil to continue powering our society. So all of these decisions were made in that period, and they really sort of structure the way our society runs today. Undoing that requires some real deliberate thinking.
So, another key point of your story was just about how other countries are thinking about this, the EU, other governments. You mentioned China. So we know that the U.S. has, under the Trump administration, has basically not done much intentionally about dealing with climate change. Emissions have, here and there been reduced for sort of other reasons, but there's been no sort of central command to lower our carbon footprint. But what is happening in other countries?
Well, it's a really interesting mix that's happening around the world. The EU is leading really with hundreds of billions of euros that are committed to building back greener. They've got commitments for renewable energy capacity, electric vehicle charging stations, for a just transition in some of the coal-dependent states where they're funding measures to retrain people. They're sort of leading the charge. Look at a place like China. The picture is mixed and still to be determined. They're funding a lot of coal-fired power plants, but at the same time building out the capacity to build for the clean energy economy. So prioritizing electric vehicles, prioritizing solar panel manufacturing, et cetera. And then you can sort of look around the world elsewhere. And if you go to a lot of developing countries, these are places that are dependent on financing from elsewhere. And so there is this newfound commitment, which I find very interesting in a lot of developing countries, to climate action that is in large part driven by, say, if they've received funding from the IMF, and the IMF says, well, we're going to give you this funding, but we want to evaluate whether you're prepared to address climate change. And so you get these interesting things where countries are spending a lot of money to build greener because they're being pushed to do so. It's hard to give like a clear picture because it's really mixed. Countries around the world are responding in different ways.
Right. And in the EU, they're calling it what? The European Green Deal?
Right. In Europe, they have a Green Deal. It's pretty remarkable. And it's funny because there's a lot of debate about it, but there's very little debate about whether they should have it. It's a question about what does it look like. It's not a controversial thing like it is here.
Right. I'm assuming from your article, the premise is that if Trump is reelected, that a lot of possibilities for reducing carbon in the atmosphere will go away, essentially. Am I right about that? And what is the outlook if Biden is elected?
You are right to say that a lot of possibilities for reducing emissions go away if Trump is reelected. The hope for a lot of climate activists is that, a Joe Biden presidency would mean big climate legislation, stimulus that funds green initiatives, a restoration of a lot of the regulations that have been overturned and an expansion of those. The one thing I would say, obviously, if Trump is reelected, it's not going to be a priority, but this issue is not going away. And it's one where, the one thing I always point to is a part of the European Green Deal is a carbon tax at the border, which means essentially they're going to be creating a tariff on goods from places that are not addressing climate change. And if you want to get Republicans in Washington, anxious about climate change, saying that there is going to be a tax on their goods is a good way to do it. So that's just one example, but the point is that, thus far, climate change on the international stage has been an issue that countries have tried to come together and address together. I think that with a second Trump presidency, we're going to start to see climate change as an issue where countries are pushing each other in a more aggressive way. And, it would be interesting to see how a potential Trump second term would deal with that.
So you discussed in your article some of the tipping points in climate if we go over some of these thresholds. What does that mean? What are the tipping points and why are they important?
Yeah, so in my story, I reference a 2019 analysis in the journal Nature, which points to 9 tipping points, any of which could be triggered somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And these are a wide range of things, anything from the melting of ice sheets in the West Antarctic to the breakdown of certain currents that regulate our weather patterns to the loss of the coral reefs. And all of these things are phenomena that would really trigger a much bigger change than we've experienced thus far. So, to lose an ice sheet that would raise sea levels significantly very fast would be a very dramatic change in warming. To have a circulatory pattern breakdown that would then, lead to rapid temperature change in certain parts of the globe. These are all things that could potentially be very close to happening and would dramatically change our world pretty close to overnight.
And you couldn't come back from them. You can't just refreeze the West Antarctic ice sheet.
Right. That's exactly right. It's like once you've crossed the tipping point, it's like, that's it. You've crossed it. And, and the world isn't over. We're not all going to go extinct, but it's going to be a different world.
All right. Well, Justin Worland, thank you so much for talking about this with us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
When Donald Trump talks about improving efficiency by retrofitting lighting systems with LED bulbs, remember what he said? He said he doesn't like LED because, quote, the light's no good. I always look orange, end of quote.
We know that climate change isn't necessarily a priority for President Trump, but we've been learning more lately about how much of a priority it would be for Joe Biden if he were elected in November. Though he was given poor marks by climate groups during the Democratic primary, he's emerged in the general election with a much bolder plan to curb planet-warming carbon emissions. Joining me now to talk about this plan is Marianne Levelle. She's a reporter with Inside Climate News. She's been following Biden's climate policy, and we've talked to her in the past about this, and we wanted to bring her back on to give us an update. Marianne, welcome back.
Glad to be here, Reed.
Okay, so as I alluded to, this is a repeat appearance for you on the Trump on Earth podcast. But when we last spoke this spring, we were sort of asking if Joe Biden could convince climate activists that he was one of them, that he understood the significance of the threat climate change poses. And he was promising to spend just a tenth of what Bernie Sanders was promising during the primaries. But since then, his policy has undergone a type of transformation. What happened to Joe Biden?
Well, Joe Biden saw exactly what we talked about when we were together before, is that he really needs to energize those progressive voters, really every part of the Democratic electorate in order to win in November. And he really realized that climate was going to be a key part of that. He got together with Bernie Sanders, not only on climate, but on several issues, to come up with unity platforms. And these teams, folks appointed both by Biden and Bernie Sanders, met every week and came up with a new plan that really ratchets up Biden's ambition substantially. One example of that is money. Before, Biden's climate plan was like 1.7 trillion over 10 years. Well, now he's talking about 2 trillion over 4 years. So that's really accelerates the government spending on climate and on clean energy and transition to electric vehicles and electricity that's clean. He also set a goal, and this was really one of the key things that Bernie Sanders folks got out of this, was that he set a goal of 2035 to have 100% clean electricity in the U.S. So that's a goal that's kind of within striking distance of the timeline that people are talking about is just so urgent.
So, yeah, I wanted to ask you about some of the specifics. That goal of carbon-free electricity, originally in his original plan, when was the year that we would arrive at this moment?
His original plan was something like, he was more talking about the 2040 sort of time frame.
So he moved the time frame up.
Right. And he was talking about 2050 really was his goal to decarbonize the economy. So the other thing about his climate plan is that he talks about having measurable goals within 4 years, which would be, of course, within his first term, to have real benchmarks to be achieved immediately. That also is very important to the activists who are focused on this. They don't like everything about Biden's plan, but he definitely has moved in their direction.
So what are some things that they didn't like about the plan?
Well, number one was that he doesn't do anything like banning fracking. That kind of has become this fault line among the Democrats, progressives, and moderates. And Biden has a very difficult job in negotiating this issue because he also cannot lose the support of blue-collar labor moderates. And what happened during this whole process is he brought in Connor Lamb from Western Pennsylvania to be one of the folks putting together this plan. And they didn't do anything like ban fracking. But first of all, there's a lot of economic incentives in this plan to turn electricity over and to reduce the demand for natural gas and oil. I think the argument is going to be that if we work on it from that angle, that you're not going to have to, take a stand like banning fracking. You're going to move the market in that direction, or that's the argument at least.
So if I'm to understand this correctly, Biden didn't want to ban fracking because who wants to lose Western Pennsylvania badly? If you need to win in Pennsylvania and maybe some other places, you're going to need some people who might not hate fracking so much or might even like it. But his argument is if we make the incentive structure a certain way, you won't really need fracking in so many years because, renewable energy will actually be more affordable, more cheaper. I mean, that's why fracking has proliferated, is because it's been able to produce energy, BTUs, so much cheaper than other means, like coal mining.
Yes, and the natural gas has driven out a lot of coal. The other thing that Biden says in his plan is that he wants to take steps to really regulate fracking in a way that it hasn't been regulated before. And if you regulate things like the methane leakage from fracking and the impact on water, you begin to have these costs of fracking that make it, well, is that really going to be economic when renewable energy prices are just headed downward? Another really interesting thing about his plan is I think everyone sees that there's a risk for climate change to fall off the map when we're all just so consumed with the coronavirus crisis. He has called this kind of build back better. That is how he has framed action on climate change as part of the response to rebuilding the economy, which is going to be very high on his agenda, no matter what. The way he is framing it, at least so far, is that acting on climate is part and parcel of what we have to do to rebuild the economy after COVID.
I'm wondering if you think this says anything, not just about Joe Biden or climate activists, but what does it say about the mood of the electorate about climate change that Biden has adopted some of these more aggressive targets and not just a sort of generic, we're going to eventually at some point reduce carbon, we're going to, put in a couple hundred charging stations and some solar panels and otherwise everything's kind of going to be the same. I mean, some of these changes, if they're enacted, could be pretty significant. I'm presuming that the Biden people look at polls and understand public opinion a little bit. Does this mean they feel safer going out on this ledge on climate?
Absolutely. You can guarantee that they have been polling on this. You can see from the plan that they've put forward that they feel that this is a winner of an issue. The Trump campaign has been calling it a socialist plan and has been saying he's the puppet of the far left. Some of the polling I heard about was it definitely is great for Biden for getting the progressives energized, but he doesn't lose moderates by showing a concern about climate change as long as it is framed as being about jobs and really economic renewal, which is exactly how he has put it. It's almost like a Green New Deal, although he doesn't use that term at all. But the focus on economics as part of the climate package, and very important, we haven't talked about environmental justice. That makes it, basically a Green New Deal, but not in name.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that because this all came out during the whole month of George Floyd protests, and obviously that issue is top of mind, systemic racism. Environmental justice, I've never seen so many articles about environmental justice. So how integral in his plan is the concept of justice?
Right. Some of the elements are that he would create a new office in the Department of Justice just to prosecute environmental justice cases. So elevating it along with, things like antitrust and civil rights. He has not rolled out fully the financing of this, although definitely raising taxes on the wealthy would definitely be a part of this but he hasn't talked in detail about carbon pricing yet. But any revenue would be directed, at least 40% of it, to environmental justice communities. So that would be a recognition that there are some communities that are dealing every day with just a much worse burden of pollution. There's more than one imperative for Biden to act on this.
Exactly. I've seen, you mentioned this, but I've seen the Trump campaign throwing out attacks based on this plan, saying, Biden's plan will kill jobs. They don't mention that it could also create clean energy jobs, that it takes away from the fossil fuel industry. But, it's politics, so you put out the information that you want. Could this hurt him in a general election? Is he now vulnerable to being seen as sort of too eager to get rid of the oil industry or the coal industry?
Definitely the Trump campaign is counting on that. And they are going to do everything they can to frame it that way. One thing that is definitely true is the coal industry has not flourished under Trump even before the coronavirus. The argument could be made that they would have benefited from more investment in a transition to cleaner energy if there was investment in those communities, which we really have not seen an investment in the communities where people would lose their jobs if there's less mining. Instead, we kind of have these bankruptcies and disruption without any sort of attention to the economic transition.
Do we know if, Biden's plan seems sort of calibrated to meet American politics right now? How calibrated is it to meet the physics and chemistry of the Earth's atmosphere? In other words, not to be too cute about it, but is it enough to limit the worst outcomes of runaway climate change?
I think that I can say unequivocally no. The science is clear that we have to decarbonize really fast. Even the slowdown in the economy that we saw in response to the coronavirus, that gives you a sense of how fast we need to decarbonize, because even that will not bring down the levels of carbon to the level that they need to be at. Of course, we can't slow down the economy to that level. We have to decarbonize the economy. We have to have the clean energy to replace the fossil fuel energy. This is going to be true whoever is elected. It's almost eternal vigilance. Those who care about climate change, they have to continue to be kind of in a permanent campaign for stronger action.
All right, Marianne. Well, maybe we'll have you back for a third time if there's some other big breaking development. Who knows?
Oh, well, glad to join you anytime.
All right. Marianne Levelle is a reporter with Inside Climate News. You can find her work at insideclimatenews.org. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at trumponearth.org or anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends while you're at it. This podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Reed Frazier. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.